today is really hopefully create a new frame for the future of work. And so to do so, let me just start off by sharing a little bit about my story and how I got into this space. So it's going to go back to 2010. And I started my career as an HR generalist at in a financial services company. And we're coming out of the 07, 08, global financial crisis. And so it was certainly not quite business as usual. And I got into HR, probably like many people who get into HR, because you want to change the world. You want to develop leaders. You want to engage employees. And my first assignment was actually laying off an entire office of employees. And the reason was really based on a financial and strategic move where the company was installing robotic process automation, so RPA. And we no longer needed the back office that we had out in Minnesota servicing these accounts. And so I went through this whole 18-month exercise, working directly with the CFO, really understanding what was top of mind for that executive C-suite and how they were beginning to navigate. No one was calling it future of work in 2010, but that's exactly what this project was, because it was technology coming in, displacing skill sets of people who had been employed for 20, 30 years at this company, doing the same job for 20 plus years. And then as part of that, we had to hire a new digital skill set in a different city. And so there was also this skill shift that was happening within the organization, as well as a displacement within one community, but a buildup within another community. And so at the time, this is why I got into this space, is I think I had a versatile reaction. It was back in the time that I joke now when we did layoffs in person. And so having to look 250 people in the eye in one day and explain to them their job was no longer needed or relevant because of robotic process automation, because of the strategy shift, because we no longer needed their skill set, really forever changed the way that I view the relationship that we as individuals have with work. And so I've spent since 2010, really focusing my career, as David mentioned, trying to understand how can we better prepare individuals for the future of work. Seeing how blindsided those people were in 2010, I've made it my life's commitment and my work commitment to ensure that we've got a better future-ready workforce who is ready to navigate the various challenges that will continue to happen. And so as we think about the future of work, there's three themes in particular that I see happening that have started since the beginning of this dialogue out in the market and persist today. That deals with fear, uncertainty, and then, which I'll explain in a little bit, mimetic behaviors. So this is back in 2013, is really when you started to hear future of work within headlines. There was this landmark study out of the University of Oxford by two professors, Frey and Osborne. They're labor economists. They did this really, I think it was a 100+ page report, and they came to the conclusion after rigorous analysis that about 47% of employment in the US was susceptible to automation or robotics. And so there was all this noise that happened back in 2013 around what are the skills that people need? How quickly was automation and robotics going to come in? And gosh, what are we going to do? This is almost 1 in 2 people who are going to be displaced in our lifetime because of technology. And so we heard a lot of this dialogue around automation. This persisted for the next several years as we thought about the future of work dialogue. These are just a couple headlines I pulled just to show with you some of the most clicked on headlines at this time. New York Times published a report saying that robotics could steal 80 million US jobs. And again, I highlight this to note the language of the negativity of the fear that was within all of this dialogue. LA Times 2 years later in 2017 came out and said robotics could take over 38% of US jobs in about 15 years. So as Frey and Osborne had a much longer timeline, we continued to see headlines as it related to the future of work that the robots are coming, and they're coming sooner than people realize. But then, no surprise, all of this dialogue came to a screeching halt in 2020 when the pandemic hit. And at the time, I was working in a large consulting company studying the future of work. And so our work program and our research program quickly shifted from the degree in which robots and automation were going to be displacing workers to how do we work today? What happens? Because as I went out and talked to 15 CIOs, chief information officers at the leading Fortune 100 companies, they told me time and time again and said, what was going to take 24 months to just even enable a remote friendly workplace. So just getting our software, whether moving from legacy systems onto the cloud, really enabling security to make remote work, That was many years down the road for us. That was not priority. And overnight, over a weekend, we had to completely shift our perspective and make that digital transformation happen so we can have business as usual. And so this became top of mind as a business continuity issue as we thought about the future of work. And again, I heard how people were taking the actual desktops, removing them from their offices and bringing them into their home offices so they can continue to work. And so fast forward to 2020, from where we were before, we went from robotics, fear, to now fear of something much deeper and much more profound, fear of life, fear of business continuity, and fear of a completely new way of working, which was foreign for so many individuals. And so today, as we think about where we are in the progression of this dialogue, no surprise, remote work continues to persist as one of the number one topics that we have today. And so what I did is I pulled this sentiment score. So we've got the access at the Research Institute, I'm a part of at Upwork, to be able to track the sentiment as people on social media, as they're dialoguing about this space. And as you'll see here, well, it's skewing positive. This is from the month of February to give you that timeline, and it had over 1 billion data points coming into our algorithm. There's still, quite a bit of split where we're still seeing quite a bit of negativity in this dialogue as well. And so what's so fascinating to me is we still have not been able to figure out, is remote work here or not? And this graph that I have here is the number of searches that people have for the term remote work. So you can see in 2015, not top of mind for many people. And it wasn't really until the pandemic hit that you see this tremendous and persistent spike of how do we work remotely in a distributed manner. And so this is something I just did this week, just for this presentation. I just wanted to Google again, this is not research, this is just reporting out on news headlines on where's the dialogue today when it comes to remote work. And honestly, I was taken back by how all over the map we still are on this conversation. So this is present day headlines this week of the latest headlines on what it means to work remote. We've got the top headline coming in saying full-time office work is dead. Then you've got another headline that's saying a company decides to end their full-time remote work and actually mandate people back into an office. There's a large tech CEO who recently changed their mind on enabling remote work and then wanting to bring people back into the office. And so the list goes on and on. And so where I'm very empathetic today is that leaders today, I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think have a clue on how to get this right. For those of you who are familiar with self-efficacy theory, we know that the primary source of feeling self-efficacy in a decision is that mastery and that previous experience that we've had. For many leaders today, and even many workers, before the pandemic, we have no mastery in how to get this right. We don't necessarily have the experience to draw from in order to chart with confidence a future forward. And so with that, there's this theory that's out there called mimetic theory. And what that says is our motivations, our desires, how we make decisions is actually not individual. The thought of us just being an individual identity in and of itself is almost a myth. Instead, because we are wired as social beings, and there's so much of our complexity behind that, the way that we make decisions and the way that we think, especially in heightened times of uncertainty, is who we aspire to be. Who is our model leader? Who is our model organization? What are they doing? And how can I begin to chart that same course? And I think that's what we're having today. As we think about specifically in the business context, who many leaders today are looking for in terms of that aspiration, I think in many times people continue to turn to tech and figure out what tech is doing. And so my question to this group today, and I think it's something for all of us to consider, is who is our model for success? Whether that's an individual leader, whether that's an organization, as we think about the future of work and companies and leaders that are actually behaving in this manner that we want to aspire to do, who is that model? And I think for a long time in the dialogue, at least as I'm tracking in the research, right now, I think Elon Musk has been held as this leader who continues to make decisions and headlines. And so I do think you see many leaders today trying to figure out their own mimetic desire and figure out, do I want to be an Elon Musk leader one day, or who else am I going to aspire to be? And I don't think we've got enough examples yet of organizations and leaders who are really charting this remote distributed first culture and way of working. And I want to explain why I think that is. And I think this is where the opportunity, especially for IO psychology, comes in. Because at the end of the day, IO psychologists really hold the pen for the ways in which we work and the rules of the road for how we engage with our employer and work design. And so I think this is really exciting to me because I don't see this as a problem, but a tremendous opportunity for the IO psychology community to come in and help fill this gap. So the root problem today is, and I apologize that this is a lengthy statement, but I know we're going to be sharing these slides. And so for those who aren't part of this presentation, I want to make sure they're able to grasp this. On the surface, it could be too easy to think the problem is we don't know how to do remote work, or we don't know how to make distributed teams work. We don't know how to work in a globalized time zone environment. I think that is merely scratching the surface of what the root problem is. The problem is we are applying old management philosophies and styles and assumptions about people at work that no longer serve us well today. Leaders don't know how to make remote work because at the end of the day, many of us actually don't trust employees to want to work. We believe, and we'll go through some of this, that our inherent assumptions that we're built on, the whole management discipline that's built on, goes back and says people are lazy. They don't want to work. And now there's probably a lot of truth when these theories were created. These were grueling jobs. This is going back in the 1920s. And even previously, when labor was hard, there wasn't air conditioning, there wasn't ping pong tables in many of the companies that we see today. And so it was difficult work. But we're in a completely different environment today. And because of that, I think we've got to update this assumption. The second thing is, I think people are struggling to really capture this unlock with AI technologies. All that fear-based headlines that you saw earlier back from 2013, 2015 are coming right back, which I see today in the form of generative AI. Some of you might have heard of that through ChatGPT, but really this dialogue around AI that is able to evolve and learn and that have been traditionally held for humans, such as creativity or writing poetry or creating images. But I think we don't know how to use AI in a way that is going to actually complement and supplement human beings because we still have an industrial mindset when it comes to working hours and workflows and how work is supposed to get done. If we're able to start with a new assumption and free ourselves, we'll actually see the opportunity that technology such as generative AI have in actually unleashing people's potential and ultimately giving us more autonomy and freedom in the way we choose to spend our lives. And then last but not least, I think we've got a lot of misaligned incentives out there in the workforce, especially when it comes to performance management. We have this focus on, again, productivity and efficiency that comes from the industrial era when we were making widgets, literally with our hands. And again, we've got to question, how do we actually create value in a knowledge-driven, service-driven economy when we're going to ask people to no longer make things with their hands, but to use their head and their heart in order to create value for the company? How do we incentivize that sort of work? And so I think what you're seeing happen today in this dialogue and where the opportunity is for SIOP and those in the HR and IO space is this opportunity to close this gap between the radical and exponential technology advancements that are happening in the workplace at stunning rates. I mean, really, when you begin to think about the technology and how that's disrupting the way we're working, really since early 2000s, it's been tremendous. But yet, if we look at that same rate of change when it comes to the way that we think about management behaviors and work design and new operating models, we haven't necessarily updated our theories and assumptions since the 1950s and 60s. Many of those same theories and assumptions continue to take hold within our thinking and within our practices today. And so for me, the field is absolutely ripe to come in and start to think about what would happen if we actually thought people wanted to work and that they would work on behalf of the organization and that they are not rational and self-interested, but instead can actually be collective and social beings and wanting to actually contribute to a common good beyond themselves. That sort of thinking actually changes everything in the way that we think about work design, motivation, performance, and all the topics that we as IO psychologists care deeply about. And so, again, what I think is happening today as we think about the future of work dialogue, I actually evoke us to go back into history and think about what needs to be updated and changed. There was this landmark paper that was written in 2005 by a scholar who stated very specifically the theories that he believed needed to be upended in order to create a better future of work. His argument, which I agree with, is unless we're going to actually talk about agency theory, which is taught, as you'll see here in the bold text, students that managers cannot be trusted to do their jobs. It comes from an inherent sense of distrust. A lot of the way that we think about organizational design is grounded in transactional, meaning that we have to create tight monitoring and controls. Think about many of the performance management systems that are out there today. Assume that we need carrots and sticks to motivate people to do a job, which again, I think there's a lot of room here to update this theory. And then, the author goes back and evokes, Porter's 5 forces, which again is a strong framework, but it leads us to a competitive mindset where we believe, each other with peers, employees, as we think about the broader ecosystem that's out there, we come from a position of competition rather than a spirit of collaboration. And so how can we think about, especially as the world becomes more complex, uncertainty will only further abound. As organizational leaders, we need to be able to play throughout an entire ecosystem and really kind of throw down our swords of competition and figure out how do we navigate this together. This is uncharted territories. And when we both go in together, we will be able to see the future much clearer. And so at the end of the day, what I really want to talk about is what is the future of work and what is it not? Because if you look out there, there's so much confusion and there's so many headlines, as we just showed from the remote work example. And again, I think that's distraction from the underlying issue that's before us today. So here's what I think the future of work actually is. It's around creating new theories around human behavior and decision-making at work. Like I mentioned before, we still have that 1970s classical, traditional, rational economic theory that persists almost through all of our organizational design at the organizational level, team level, leader level, and individual level that really needs to be updated to think through. In today's context, what if we assumed we can trust people at work? What would that unlock? The second thing I think the future work is about re-examining historical management assumptions and work models. We all know, again, one of the other top headlines out there is around the 4-day work week. And that's a whole other topic for discussion, but whether it's 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, pick a number. I think what the headline is evoking is the fact that people don't feel that current model is working today. And so we feel that this industrial butts and seats, 8 to 5 mindset and the way that we work is no longer serving us well. And so what are the new work models that we can start to create that enable flexibility, that enable us to actually thrive in our workplaces? The third thing that I think the future of work is about creating a sustainable and more inclusive work environment. As we know, many of the theories and many of the researchers that I've even talked about today come from a time and place that no longer reflects our culture, no longer includes women, people of color who are participating in guiding theories in our conversation. And so I think this is, again, an opportunity for diverse candidates to come in and help us think differently, get us out of our classic paradigms that really are not working for all, and begin to create theories and ideas and assumptions about people that are much more inclusive than we have today. And then at the end of all of this, what this actually leads us to in the future of work is asking really hard questions about ourselves and our leaders. Are we, within ourselves, and figure out, where are we the blocker in this conversation? Where, from a leadership perspective, where do we want to see our leaders being held accountable and making different decisions on behalf of the workforce, on behalf of society, in order to create, again, a more inclusive and sustainable future than we're in today? And then on the flip side, I think this is equally important to talk about. The future of work is not fear-based headlines. So those you can find in Google at any point in time. I caution you to go down too much of that rabbit hole, as again, I think that's distraction and noise from the root issue that, again, many people are feeling that just don't quite know how to articulate it. And that's, again, where we as a community can come in and help provide the language and framework to really diagnose why people feel this way and begin to create a conversation filled with a lot more gravitas towards a solution that needs to be built. Future of work is also not about falling in love with the problem. People feel that work is broken today. Those of you on the call or listening on the recording might also feel this, that work is not meaningful. Many people are going through the motions. And as a result of that, we tend to admire and fall in love with the problem. But the future of work dialogue has got to start moving to solutions if we're going to get out of this carousel that many of us feel like we've been in since 2020. The future of work is also not about creating new processes or new terminology and names for old way of doing things. We really have to upend the current paradigm and start building a new foundation and not continue to apply Band-Aids over this. And last but not least, it's certainly not reducing the complexity to short-term solutions. As we've talked about today, the future of work is a very complex dialogue, and we have to have the time and patience and space. And again, diverse set of people contributing to this conversation in order to actually create a future of work that not only we want to be a part of, but we also the legacy we want to leave behind. So what I'd love to do real quick is just take you the next couple of minutes before we open up to Q&A, just take you through a practical example of what does this mean, of how do we actually get started to upend paradigms and assumptions about people at work that seems like pushing a boulder up a very large hill. And so I just want to take you through this quick example to show you actually when we begin to have this dialogue, the different ways and ideas that can emerge within organizations that are actually relatively small, but I think can have ripple effect. So the first question I have for this group today is, and I ask this to leaders all the time, is do you believe that people want to work? Like inherently, if given the choice, will people still choose to work? Or, will they choose complete leisure and laziness for the foreseeable future? And so that's really a core question that we have to ask ourselves. And, I bring up Dr. Spock here because, if we go back to all the assumptions that organizational behavior is built on, the answer to that is no. We believe from a classic economic perspective in the Homo economicus, who's the economic man. And this is coming back from John Stuart Mill, who was very much influenced by Adam Smith, who's considered the father of capitalism, who basically said that we as human beings will choose not to work at any choice we have. We would much rather pursue conveniences, necessities, luxuries, and that we will do the most bare minimum effort in order to get the job done. And so all this thinking, really came about and said that people are rational. They don't really think with their feelings. We're very rational beings, and we know how to maximize our leisure time. And everything we do is going to go towards that end. And so as a result of that, I want to just share with you the theory of reason action that says, okay, our beliefs about a particular topic, we're going to use this particular case, people at work, people don't want to work, then creates the attitudes towards the topic, negative or positive. So if we're starting from this assumption that we can't trust people, they don't want to work, we're then going to start with a posture making decisions around a negative attitude, and when it comes to work in general. That negative attitude then leads to our behavioral intention, our motivation. To what degree are we willing to actually engage in the activity? So again, we don't trust people, tend to have a negative sentiment, and so our motivation to act is going to be very low. And that's where you come in today and enter in performance management and command and control style leadership behaviors, because this was all built from, again, well-intended logic, rational theory. People don't want to work, so we need to intervene. And that then leads to actions and behaviors and the policies that we create. And so what I'm trying to illustrate today is if we were to start all the way back at the funnel, because it's not the actions and behaviors we need to fix. And I think that's where many of the future of work conversations are happening, without actually fixing the very front of how we arrived at those actions. I don't think we're going to see progress. And I think that's why we made such little progress when we really think about the different organizational designs, work models. Why remote work is seemingly so hard for many organizations is because of where we start about beliefs about people at work. And so what I encourage you to do when you go back to your organization is just take this simple diagram and start mapping out what are our beliefs and assumptions around people at work, and how does that then actually lead to our actions, norms, culture, and behaviors that we adopt day in and day out. And so my big question I have for you is, what would happen in the future of work if we assumed people actually wanted to be there, that people wanted to do good, that we could trust people to do a good job? What sort of culture, leadership behavior, and org designs could we come up with that would create that model based on this assumption? So with that, I want to thank this group. I'm going to stop sharing so I can actually go back and see any questions that are coming in and go from there.
Wow. I feel that's all I can say right now. I mean, that was a tremendous talk, Kelly. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, David, for having me. And I appreciate all the work you're doing at Meta towards the end in helping rewrite some of these assumptions. So really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much.
Anybody have any questions for Kelly? Go ahead, Janet. You can either come off mute or type it in the chat, whatever you're more comfortable with.
It might be easier just to speak it. So I'm thinking of when you gave that first illustration and you shared about having to look a few hundred people in the eye and say, basically this is your last day, or we're shifting gears and you're not, going to be working here anymore. I don't want to say you're not needed because we're all needed, but to say you're not going to be working specifically here anymore. And this whole other field of robotics was opening up. And so as one door was closing, another door was opening. My question is, what was some of the feedback you got from those members who were hearing this? You said they'd been working in that same line of work for 20 or 30 years. And were they eligible for retirement? Were they redundant now? Did they have to go back and retrain? What kind of questions did they ask? What were some of the concerns that they had? Because we can get excited about the idea that when one door closes, another one opens. But what about the people who may not be at a place in their career where they want to retrain or they want to shift gears? And for them, it really is the end of the road.
Jen, thank you so much for that question. And I think it's very thoughtful. And I think I'm also a big believer in looking at reality. And, so as I go reflect back on that time, the reality is it was, this isn't scientific, but I would say it was about 50-50. 50% of the population was going to be able to have the runway required to reskill and retrain and make even an industry pivot, because we were one of the first, the company I worked at, to actually do this. And so I did see a few other of those individuals go to other financial services companies who were just 1 or 2 years delayed from the process. I saw this group of individuals become in this endless cycle of layoffs because they were just bouncing to the, basically the last in line company who was unable to do that. So that was one cohort of individuals. Another cohort of individuals was, which is just really heartbreaking. And I think this is what we've got to figure out. And this is a much bigger conversation, even outside of we as IO psychologists can't solve for. I mean, this takes business leaders, public policy, government to intervene as well. But the reality is there was many people who had about 5 years or so left, preferably in their careers. And so trying to actually make that sort of pivot into a new industry or learning an entirely different field was too large of a barrier to overcome. And so some of them ended up going into part-time employment. Some of them took on contractor freelancer roles. Some of them went into, teaching or something very different to get them by. And so I do think we have a tremendous responsibility. I think we're just beginning to see this wave of generative AI that's going to likely displace individuals who are unlikely to be expecting this. And so what is our responsibility to them to make sure that we give people a long enough runway to have economic opportunity in the future of work? And I think that's just a really difficult question to grapple with. And it's certainly something that, to be frank, haunts me to this day, of knowing we displaced those people without a true runway to lead into something different, because this takes time to reskill, especially when we start talking about these kind of technologies. It takes economic investment that not everyone has. And it certainly takes emotional gravitas to get through that and go through that type of experience and be able to pick yourself back up. And so I think it's a lot of complexity. And I think we're going to be getting into this next wave as we think about the technologies that are coming. So that's a really thought-provoking question, and I appreciate that.
I'll jump in with a question for you, Kelly. Other people can, of course, chime in too. So in my current role, I get I launch surveys from time to time and in our organization. And as part of that process, we get to then dashboard on the data, right, that's associated with it. And so there's a bit of it that could be compliance related, just to give like high level context of what I'm about to ask. And so it was really fascinating to me. I'm a very like benefit of the doubt sort of mentality in the way that I manage things. And so when this certain team came to me a few months ago with a request to build a dashboard with their outcomes on it, I was also asked to include, like a list of people who maybe didn't respond, right? Let's just call it that. And so people who didn't comply with the action, basically. And so to go back to your, base question of, do people actually want to work? Do they want to do what they're asked to do, right? In specific, it kind of made me think a little bit when you said that about this example that, I pushed back on that. Yes, it's good to track, right, and monitor, but again, to like make that like a public, we're going to watch and see who's doing their job and not doing their job sort of thing, right? Just didn't sit right with me. And so to your point, needing to change the thinking of where we assume that, it's going to be the negative and people aren't going to want to do something, right, mentality versus give them a chance maybe, right, or some other approach. I'm seeing that, right, in some of what I'm even being asked to do now. So yeah, I just want to put that out there and see what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. I mean, and I think the reality is, as like most of our legal and government is set up, we tend to write rules for the very small proportion who we know will never be compliant. That is a reality. I'm not ignorant to saying, okay, well, 100% of the population now wants to work, 100% of the population wants to do what's right on behalf of, the reality is we're always going to have a small, but I think it's much smaller than, most people realize, of people who don't comply or do the right thing. And that's where I tend to pivot more towards behavioral economics and think about the ways in which we can use nudge theory to make it easier for people to do the right thing. Oftentimes in our systems, there's so much friction at times doing the right thing. And I'm not saying with your example, there's friction, but whether it's bureaucracy or I'm already, so much job demand, overload, this is another thing on my list, I'm just not accurately prioritizing, whatever the case is. That's where, again, where I think nudge theory comes in. I also think just in using, social learning theory, being able to have peer accountability is a much healthier way than necessarily public accountability. So matching, like-minded individuals together goes back to that mimetic theory. We tend to want to comply and do things that people we admire are doing. And so, that's just another example. But I think you're right. I mean, I think your gut instinct is right. I think this is going to be something, again, as a community, we're going to have to grapple with. The more access we have to human behavior and the digital exhaust that we have of what people are doing or not doing, starting with that assumption becomes that much more critical. And really because the scale at which we can then, I think, potentially create harm in organizations, doing what we think is right on behalf of management theory and everything else, actually can end up, I think, with some pretty detrimental outcomes in the long run. So I appreciate bringing up that example. And, for those that are facing a similar situation, definitely would recommend more of a behavioral economics approach to nudge people to compliance.
Great. Thanks for that response.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a thought. I wrote this down. Thank you for the talk. I don't have an answer to this, and there might not be an answer to this, but with Chat GPT and AI like evolving now and kind of being on the forefront of everyone's mind, one thing that keeps coming to mind is how do you make yourself AI proof, or is it possible to make yourself AI proof where you'll be okay when AI comes in? And should we be thinking that way? Well, thinking more along the lines of, well, have a plan B and a C always, and keep that as your AI proof kind of a solution. I was just wondering your thoughts on that, or anything I said.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rick, for that. I think it's a great question. And to your point, I don't know if there's going to necessarily be a correct answer, but, obviously offer a perspective. There's an article that a professor out of the University of North Carolina, him and I have collaborated on, and it's in press right now. So I can't share it yet, but his name is Monahan, and he came up with this great framework to think about, specifically in the light of generative AI that's really infusing in our workplaces, which is where do we as humans have competition? Like, we have competitive skills against AI that are likely to be enduring for the foreseeable future. I'm not going to make any promises that we'll always remain competitive, but there's certain things to this day. I mean, even just thinking about the example Michelle just gave, she used the words, I think you said like my instinct or my gut told me that wasn't right. That right now is still a very human tendency that we need to rely on and continue to learn. And there's neuroscience, and I think that's why there's such a push for well-being, is how do we really make sure that as human beings, our senses that we have, we continue to develop and remain strong on. And I think the skills that you're talking about that people do have a responsibility to start to learn are those in which we cooperate with generative AI. So those things that make us better or unleash kind of our superhuman capabilities. And so like as an example with generative AI, ChatGPT, you can go in and ask it to write a script or a poetry or something that's creative. But a lot of the feedback right now we're getting is that it's pretty dull, it sounds robotic, but yet it gives us a sense of efficiency and speed. I think the same is true with software engineers and coding. Now, there's a whole bunch of privacy issues still that we've got to sort out. There's a whole bunch of credibility and factual sources, original artist and or coder, but we'll leave that, put a pin in that enormous conversation for a second and say, the more that we can get better at speaking ChatGPT and giving it prompts and being able to work alongside of it and use it as a tool for our productivity will then only make us better and allow us to continue to compete with AI on our uniquely human skills, which again allows us to be more creative, innovative, value add, which is why I think this work redesign is absolutely so necessary. Our current work models and the way we think about work and workflows actually do make us at danger of becoming obsolete, which is why we've got to, I think, figure out what is that work model in the future that allows humans to capture what we're really good at and allows us to move the needle even further. I mean, there's so many big issues that we should be tackling, whether that's climate change, inequity, these things we should be freeing some of our capacity and some of our brightest and top talent from some of the mundane to be able to go tackle, I think, thornier issues where we need the best and brightest talent thinking and solving for alongside AI. So I'll send you the article once it comes out, but I think about it as where can you compete as a human and stay enduring? And then where you need to learn is where you can cooperate, because your peers who can learn how to cooperate will end up working faster, better, and smarter as a result. So hopefully that answers your question. That was a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any other questions for Kelly, or even any questions for maybe Rick and David about membership benefits, conference?
It looks like Janet has raised her hand.
Go ahead, Janet.
I wanted to wait to make sure no one else wanted the floor first. I'm just kind of pondering some of the things that were just shared, and I see a connection between the need to shift as people may be kind of nudged out of certain areas because of information, artificial intelligence and those types of things. And I see a connection between that and resume screening tools and the fascination with having people apply for jobs who are experts and have degrees in certain areas. At what point do we have to consider that people are being nudged out of certain areas, but they still have expertise, they still have creativity, they still have a lot of knowledge, a lot of years under their belt. And just because their degree is in one area or another, or their job titles were in one area or another, getting screened out of other opportunities that they could do, regardless of what maybe their major was in college or what their title was from their last job. And so allowing people to maybe a little bit more easily, kind of more fluidly move from one role to another, because maybe this dynamic is forcing them to have to do that. And so how do they get through all that screening tool?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I think there's a lot of ethical considerations to how we're building those tools today. And I know there's already been some dialogue around the sorts of screens we're using and where a college degree is absolutely necessary. I mean, Google is famous for coming out with their study that they found having a college degree actually had little to no predictive success on that person's longer term employment. Instead, it was much more around again, I'm going to go evoke our, enduring human skills around emotional intelligence and being able to essentially politically savvy within an organization, which by all means, a college degree often doesn't predict. The one thing that I am tracking, and honestly, full disclosure, why I'm at Upwork, which is the talent marketplace platform, is it's becoming a home for many individuals who are unable to find that full-time employment right now because of all the constant change, because of, having to continue to update their skill sets. What we, a study recently found is those that are freelance or contractors or working in some sort of alternative work arrangements are being forced and actively engaging in some sort of upskilling or reskilling every 6 months, because they're being exposed to so much different context switching and being able to engage in a deeper variety of topics. Where, which I thought this was pretty alarming. The same study found that, and just so you know, this was a third party, this was not a Upwork study, so no bias in that. Full-time employees, about 1 in 2, 49%, had either never engaged in upskilling activities or had been over a year or two since they've engaged in that, because that force mechanism wasn't there. And so I do think, again, these are like societal issues, because then we have to talk about social safety nets and healthcare and benefits and making sure that people are set up for long-term retirement. But I do think there's this emerging talent marketplace that's, we're really seeing an uptick where people are coming and finding just a better fit with a lot more variety as the world of work changes. So it's certainly an answer for some, obviously not for all. And so I think this is something we're certainly going to have to continue to grapple with. And then for organizations and those that are providing full-time employment, again, that's where we're getting after the inclusive and more sustainable future. We can't go back and say, okay, you have an elite, degree, an MBA, this means you're going to be successful here. I think, especially as IO psychologists, and the amount of data that we now have, we could probably build much smarter and predictive algorithms that really will continue to point to that the credentials isn't going to be what makes or breaks someone. Again, it's going to be their enduring human qualities, and they're able to contribute within the organization at large. But definitely a thorny issue coming up in the future of work for sure.
Nice. Are there 1 more minute for any more questions? No.
So I have one question. It's probably a bit more narrow in scope, and it actually has to do with something that you had mentioned very early on in your talk, Kelly. It seems like more and more people are going to be expected or just required to work within teams that are distributed across a lot of time zones. At least on a day-to-day basis, I'm in New England and I'm talking with people on the West Coast or people in, London or Singapore. And that definitely can pose a lot of challenges. Just really finding that time to connect one-on-one. Sometimes I think in particular when there's a mixture of native languages on the team and you're communicating asynchronously, it's easy for things to be misinterpreted. What sorts of, with that in mind, how do you think organizations are going to have to adjust their workflows or their means of collaborating?
Yeah, David, I think that's a great question. I think that's something that many organizations, seeing in my research, are absolutely still grappling with. No one has quite solved, here's the holy grail to make hybrid and globalized talent models work. There's still a lot of friction, and it's a painful experience for many individuals on both sides of the pond. I hear it. And so, the way that I'm thinking about this, I think there's a couple different ways organizations can go. Some organizations are really just staffing to no more than 3 time zones and just staffing project teams based on that, because trying to solve and do the deeper culture, leadership, async best practices work is going to be too long of a time horizon for them. And I am seeing a lot of organizations, quite frankly, have success with that, where they're being bounded by those time zones for a project. Now, the risk in that is that you might be losing access to the best talent that might be existing somewhere else that could actually be the right fit for the team. So those who are willing to have a longer runway for solving this I mean, something at Upwork we're working really hard on right now too is like, what are those async best practices that feel human? Right now, async work doesn't feel very human. It feels like we're all on our own individual islands, and to your point, writing comments, and there's a lot of room for interpretation and lack of emotion. And so just a simple little practice that one team has adopted for async communication, they're sending videos back and forth. And so as opposed to just leaving a comment, taking the 2-3 minutes at the end of their day, literally giving a video message to the person who's going to be picking it up in the other time zone. And again, we're seeing a lot of much more human connection with that. We're seeing a lot more collaboration and satisfaction with the time zone changes as a result of that. So unfortunately, I still think this is a huge wave of opportunity to really figure out how we redesign work to make this happen. And the more that I'm learning about best practices from other companies, I mean, again, this is why we need to have a more like open perspective and be knowledge sharing across industries. I think this is really a humanity problem we're all trying to solve for and want to make work better. And so the more that we can share best practices, I think the better for us all.
All right, thank you for that.
All right. Well, I think we're right about at time. So thank you again, Kelly, so much for your time and sharing your expertise with us today. It was fascinating. So glad you were able to make the time to speak with everybody here and answer our questions as well. Everyone who was able to join on the call, thank you so much for attending. You will be sent a follow-up survey. If you can provide some feedback for us, that would be really, really helpful. Again, IO is trying to collect some data and then take some action accordingly, trying to do our best practices ourselves. We really appreciate that as well. Otherwise, feel free to reach out. Again, David and Rick are your expert points of contact at any point in time for anything. Otherwise, thank you all again so much, and we look forward to seeing you around SIOP.
Thank you,
everybody.